Okay, my name is Andrew Stokes. I'm the Managing Director of ClarityEnglish, and let's have a look at my topic for today. Practical ideas for using technology to create a better approach to educational delivery. All right, several years ago, I was on the PTA committee of this school here in Hong Kong, Clearwater Bay School, which both my daughters attended. One day in a PTA committee meeting, pretty much out of the blue, the management announced that every classroom in the school would be equipped with an interactive whiteboard before the next academic year, which was just 6 months off. Well, these boards are, or certainly were at that time, pretty expensive. At that time, you wouldn't get much change out of $10,000, Australian dollars for one. Multiply that by 25 classrooms, and you're talking serious money. Not only that, they were going to send 2 teachers to London for a week's training, and that doesn't come cheap either. The school was going to pay for part of this project, but there was a shortfall, and the PTA was tasked with a massive, and I mean massive, fundraising operation. And I have to say, we were successful, and the project went ahead, and every single classroom was equipped with a board. Now, 5 years later, I was making a visit to the school, and what did I see? Yes, the teachers were using these interactive whiteboards. They were wielding the digital pens, but they were only using them as pens. They were projecting from the laptop, but they were only using the whiteboard as a screen. So what that meant was the outcome was that the whiteboards were not interactive whiteboards anymore. They were just whiteboards. And we had funded the most expensive whiteboards in the world. That's a bit depressing, isn't it? But I doubt very much whether anyone watching is surprised. I'm absolutely sure that you all have similar stories of edtech failures to tell. And maybe that's why you're here today. What I want to do is to highlight 3 cases of edtech project failures, to look at 3 lessons we can learn from them, and then to turn these lessons into guidelines for success. Finally, we'll contextualize these guidelines by looking at a project that's gone well at another school here in Hong Kong. And by the way, when it comes to the 3 failures, I want to be clear that I'm not in any way pointing the finger at anyone or any institution. In failing, these institutions should be seen as the norm rather than the exception. And we need to learn from these past failures to turn them into future successes. Okay, case number 2. At the beginning of last year, just a month before the pandemic struck, I visited a British Council teaching centre in Southeast Asia. First, some background. We at Clarity have a long-term partnership with the British Council globally to publish Road to IELTS, which you can see on the screen. It's the official British Council online IELTS prep course. This project started in 2006, and it was to create an online resource so that British Council IELTS candidates could feel more confident with the nature of the exam, could try out some of the unusual task types that you find in IELTS, could watch videos from British Council teachers, and could do practice papers. So both sides, the British Council and Clarity, researched the needs of test takers and of the institutions that would be using the programme, including schools, universities, and public libraries. So this time, we're not talking about a waste of money. On this visit in January last year, I wanted to see how Road to IELTS was actually being used in the IELTS prep classes in the teaching centre. And what I discovered was it wasn't being used at all. The teachers who wanted to use online materials had been given pretty much free rein to do whatever they liked. They didn't have time to research online resources properly, and each teacher was doing their own thing and using websites that they'd chosen themselves. Here are some examples. Okay, some of these may be perfectly good, but they were finding some pretty questionable stuff too. And now management was getting worried about quality control. And I'm sitting here in the meeting, listening to all this, and I'm thinking, you've just spent 15 years developing a top-of-the-range course that's actually yours. So what's going on here? And it was pretty clear that there was an issue of a lack of guidance and institutional support. Teachers simply weren't aware that they had access to Road to IELTS. So that's EdTech failure number 2. On to my third and final example. Earlier this year, I was talking with a teacher at a university in Queensland. There she is. This was during the pandemic, of course, and all the classes were online. The teachers had been set up on Zoom with students not just in Australia and East Asia, but right across the world, as far as West Africa and even South America. That's a great thing, of course, and the university was able to reach out to students who would not normally have been able to come to Australia in person. But it does add the extra burden of time differences and sleepy students onto the teacher's workload. Now, at this university language centre, the teachers were expected to give hour-long Zoom classes, 1 solid hour in front of the students. The teacher I was talking to had tried group work by putting students into Zoom breakout rooms just to break things up. But she discovered that the students just sat there and said nothing. Now, doing a class like this for an hour is bad enough. But when you have 4 or 5 classes in a day, it's shattering. You end up with students who aren't learning much and demoralized teachers. So that is EdTech project failure number 3. So number 1 is the whiteboards, number 2 is the online IELTS prep resources, and number 3 is the Zoom teaching. Okay, as I've said, we shouldn't feel surprised by IT-related failures. After all, these don't just happen in education. Here are some headlines. Okay, I'm sure these all look very familiar. So we shouldn't be surprised, but we should feel bad about it, because when we allow a failure to take place, we are robbing institutions, teachers, and students of a positive outcome and substituting a negative one. And it's a little bit worse than that, because we are also reinforcing the expectation that tech is going to fail, that is bound to fail. And as you can see from the collage on the screen, there is a very real expectation of failure. So what can we learn from these 3 cases? What I want to do is to isolate a single cause of failure for each one and to look at how this can be avoided in future. Of course, the causes of failure are in reality are far more complex, but focusing on a single one is useful in looking for lessons to learn, and from that, in devising solutions and guidelines. Right, case 1, the interactive whiteboards. Cause of failure? In my opinion, one of the main causes of failure was ego. The school wanted to look good. A primary motivation, looking back on it, was that they wanted to show they had all the latest technology, that they were a cutting edge school. Case 2, IELTS prep. The problem I'd like to highlight here was the lack of guidance for teachers and therefore the lack of control over the project itself. As I've said before, there was a failure of institutional support. Perhaps this is understandable in a very large institution with multiple operations all over the world, like the British Council. But nevertheless, it's true that the less guidance a project stakeholders have, the more likely the project is to get into trouble. And case 3, Zoom teaching in Queensland. This was a failure of change management, a failure of professional development. As we all know, the situation changed pretty quickly, almost overnight, from face-to-face teaching to remote teaching. And the management's initial reaction was, okay, let's shift to Zoom. That'll save the day. And of course, that's fine. But there was no proper follow-up to ensure that what would save the day in the short term would be a sustainable model for successful educational delivery in the medium and long term. So let's turn to the question of how we can avoid making these mistakes in the future. And I'd like to spin these lessons around and suggest 3 guidelines that need to be in place for any successful EdTech project. Let's go back first to Clearwater Bay School and the interactive whiteboards. What is the question for which interactive whiteboards were the answer? And was that question ever asked or even defined? When it comes to EdTech projects, I think it's useful to take a big step back and make sure we understand the role, or rather the multiple roles, of tech in the first place. Only once we have this broad picture in our mind can we look at a specific project in its correct context. Now, there's a simple genius behind an activity devised by Pete Sharma, who you may be familiar with. He's a great teacher trainer. And he developed this idea, teacher training idea, in the UK many years ago. And it goes to the heart of why and when we should use tech. So simply draw a grid like this, and on one side write role of the teacher, and on the other side write role of technology, whatever that might be, in this case, interactive whiteboard. Now, you can do this to think about the role of tech in general, or in this case, we're going to apply it specifically to IWBs. I'm going to be silent now for 15 seconds. And just by looking at this grid, I'm sure you'll start asking yourself, actually, what are the benefits of using an IWB? Okay, so it's just 15 seconds. So see if you can think of at least one idea. And it starts now. Okay, now you might have started thinking to yourself that IWBs are engaging because they're multisensory, sight, hearing, and touch. Or you might have started thinking that they're good for reviewing lessons, for recording and reviewing, or whatever. But I'm sure that you can see how to do this activity. Get the stakeholders into a session. Get them to do it individually. Move on to pair work to share ideas, then group work and a plenary session. You'll be amazed by what comes out of the discussion. And of course, here we're thinking about IWBs, but it would work equally well for exam preparation, IELTS prep, or remote teaching on Zoom. That's the 3 projects we've discussed, or any other edtech project for that matter. And then when you're 3 months into the pilot, because let's hope you are going to do a pilot, when you're 3 months into the pilot, do the exercise again, and you'll get a whole load of fresh ideas. Okay, doing a proper needs analysis it's important because it will lead to buy-in from the stakeholders, which is essential for the next question. Is participation in this project by the teachers voluntary or compulsory? As teachers, we see ourselves as individualists. We cherish the idea of doing our own thing in our own classroom. I know what works for me and my students. But as managers or project leaders, we need to recognize that for an edtech project to succeed, it can't be voluntary. To put it another way, there must be a high degree of institutional guidance so that people are not just working together, but are seen to be working together. This is an interesting one, and I'm sure you recognize the concept. Excuse me. But let me give you an example from my own office here at Clarity, because yes, we fail too. 3 years ago, we introduced a time tracker for management and staff. We needed to know how much time we spent on different aspects of projects so that we could accurately allocate resources for the future. Excuse me. Secondly, when a member of staff had 2 roles, say technical support and working on the website, they needed to know how much time they were spending on each. So we asked everyone in the company to put their data in at the end of the day, and they did. And there was a level of about 95% acceptance or compliance, exceeding even what we'd hoped for. And in general, people were pretty positive, supportive, and found it useful. This year, we did a review of the system, and we decided that there were some people for whom it had no relevance. Perhaps they only worked on one task, or perhaps their work wasn't project related, or whatever it might have been. So we decided that these people didn't need to do it anymore. What happened next? Yes, you guessed it. Everyone stopped doing it. Even those people who genuinely found it useful and who were required to do it. It was very much all or nothing. Okay, this is pretty interesting stuff, isn't it? This all or nothing situation. Why should that be the case? Well, without going into too much detail, we can understand what's happening through organizational psychology. Within a group, for all sorts of reasons, group members will adhere to social norms. Once these behaviors cease to be norms, well then it's much less important to stick to the rules anymore, and gradually they fall away. And that's not something we can change. It's evolutionary psychology. It's hardwired. We just need to recognize it. So that is why lesson 1, the needs analysis, is so important. You need buy-in because you need to make it compulsory within the group. And making it, whatever it is, a social norm gives all sorts of other benefits too. It saves resources. In the IELTS example, there would never be any question of time spent researching multiple websites. Training can be streamlined and standardized. And it ensures quality. It means that you can subject the solution you've chosen to quality control, proper quality control. Ultimately, it means it can work. It can be a success. But it can only really work well with the proper professional development. Over the last 18 months, far too many teachers have been put in front of a Zoom screen with no more than a functional training in Zoom itself, and they've just been expected to get on with it. So lesson 3 is that management needs to provide appropriate and adequate professional development. Really, this should not need to be said, especially here in the education sector, but it does. So let's consider these 3 guidelines. Number 1, conduct a needs analysis. Number 2, make the initiative a norm. And number 3, run adequate professional development. So far, we've looked at 4 projects which failed, including the Clarity project. Now, apart from being a bit gloomy, this tells us only that the absence of the criteria we've isolated can lead to failure. What we really need to know, of course, is that their presence will contribute to success. So let's finish up with a success story. Now, of course, life is not neat and tidy, so this is not going to be a perfect fit. But nevertheless, these 3 elements I've identified are all present in the case study I'm going to describe. Shung Tak College, Shung Tak Catholic English College in the Hong Kong New Territories is a Band 1 secondary school. Let's have a look at it. Okay. Band 1 is the highest of the 3 bands for Hong Kong schools. It's an English medium school, and it's got a good reputation as a really go-getting, high-flying, go-ahead institution. This is the story of their successful edtech project. So as with all projects, it started with a problem, an issue identified by the English teachers. They felt that students going into the final year needed to improve their study skills, both for their final exams and for their university careers thereafter. Okay, as we all know, 95% of students, maybe 99%, need to improve their academic study skills. And the teachers at Shung Tak had been aware of this. But they were highlighting it now because the pandemic had brought it to a head. The school had been closed for 6 months. Students were studying at home, stuck on their own. And so study skills were more important than ever. Right, let me introduce the project leader, Miss Aubrey Kwan. Here she is. Crucially, the first thing she and the other teachers did was, yes, to conduct a needs analysis. They thought they wanted an online academic study skills program, but is that actually what they needed? And if so, how could they choose the one that would best meet those needs? The needs analysis they conducted covered 2 main areas. First, the content and the skills they needed to help students with. So for example, they identified independent learning. That's a really vital one in the context of the pandemic, as is critical thinking. And there were others, such as giving a presentation. But as well as the content, they worked to identify the nature of the resource that would be most likely to succeed. Okay, it had to be engaging because students would be working on it alone. It needed to have authentic texts, and it needed to be easily accessible as supports would be remote. So by the end of this process, they knew what they were looking for, and they were able to draw up a checklist. Then they researched a number of candidate resources and were able to measure each of them against the points on the checklist. But it went beyond an objective ticking of boxes. It was seen as very important that teachers knew their students and were able to make judgments based on what they knew subjectively that their students would find difficult or easy. That meant that teachers had agency in what they could see was a fair and effective selection process. They finally settled on a program called Study Skills Success. So that was step 1, the successful implementation of a needs analysis. The next step was PD, professional development, or familiarization, as they called it. There were two sides to this. Firstly, familiarizing the teachers with the resource, and secondly, discussing collaboratively how best to implement it or deploy it. One of the tools they used for step one was a PD resource that comes with Study Skills Success, a worksheet entitled Getting to Know the Programme. So in a 40-minute PD session, teachers, get into pairs and answer the 14 questions on the worksheet. To do this, they have to access the programme, and once they've got in, they need to explore the functionality and the content. That means they get to experience it firsthand, just as the students will experience it. That means in turn that they're going to feel very confident with the programme. And it's obvious that this will increase the chances of it being used successfully, isn't it? On the second point, which is how to deploy the programme with students, they came up with a rather ingenious idea. They were going to start using the programme in term one, so they gave the students a simple task to do over the summer holidays. All they had to do was to try one exercise from each of the 10 units. And the idea was that by the time they returned to school, they would feel comfortable with the programme. But the teachers went a step further in order to reinforce this familiarization. So at the beginning of term, by which time they were allowed back to school for at least part of the day, at the beginning of the term, each teacher gave one in-class introductory session. This was so that students could explore the programme together and to ask questions or raise any issues that had come up over the holidays. Ms. Kwan decided not to do this in a computer lab. She asked her students to whip out their mobile phones in class and try an exercise right there and then. And this was also to show the students that they could truly use the programme anytime and anywhere. This is brilliant, isn't it? It's absolute textbook conception and execution with no corners cut. On the third issue of institutional guidance and of making this a mandatory resource, well, you can see that this box is already partially ticked. Involving the teachers in the needs analysis gave them an investment in using the programme. But the school took two more important measures. Firstly, cross-referencing with the curriculum. Okay, this is not their real curriculum, which I don't have access to, but it's an example of how to cross-reference items in one syllabus with those in another. So for example, when students were due to give presentations, this cross-referencing would easily enable Miss Kwan to assign the students to the speaking unit to improve their presentation skills. Or prior to the mock exams, the syllabus would cross-reference with the independent learning unit, which deals with preparing for an exam. Secondly, and finally, the school also attached the programme usage to the students' end-of-year report card. It didn't affect their grades, but it did note their progress through Study Skills Success. It was mandatory. And this, of course, reinforces the importance that the teachers as a group attach to usage of the programme. It's nice to end with a success story. It's inevitable that edtech will become more and more central to teaching and learning. And that's why it's so important that we understand how to make it a success. If you ask me, most of what I've said today is basically common sense. Yes, every project should start with a needs analysis so that we can conceptualize the project in the round and lay the proper foundations. Yes, we need institutional guidance and support. And that guidance needs to take into account group psychology. Yes, of course, we need professional development. But I feel there's one more element exhibited by the Shung Tak project that needs to stand behind all three of these guidelines, and that is sincerity. What Ms. Kwan showed so clearly is that if you go into the project honestly and sincerely, understanding the work that has to be done and not cutting corners, well then, this is the key. This is how you deliver positive outcomes to yourself, your colleagues, and your students. It sounds a bit old-fashioned, I know, but sincerity is, above all, I think, the key to success. Thank you for listening.